Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again, and you'll find this session, I think, it'll get you thinking more about how to be more flexible and adaptive in some of the work that you find yourself in. My background is in engineering and eventually project management. I was in custom machine design for a lot of the years. So when a client couldn't find an off-the-shelf solution to whatever challenge they were going through, that's when they'd come to me and my team and we'd design something from the ground up. And so it was quite a fluid process, and not all of my inventions were super successful, but a few of them were, and that's what got me into project management, where I would kind of be overseeing the builds, for example. So I thought I'd just start with kind of comparing and contrasting an agile approach to a more traditional approach that we call a waterfall approach, where you kind of one phase spills into the next. And so this was originally developed for the software industry because they determined that if they took a traditional waterfall or sequential approach to developing a piece of software, by the time they actually rolled it out to the end users, you and I, we no longer needed it or wanted it. Things just move too quickly nowadays. And so they needed a way of kind of staying in tune with the how society was quickly changing. And it's not the only industry that's evolving very quickly. And so that's why it's been adopted for a lot of different industries. And so this was the manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working solutions over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a really rigid plan. Now, in the work that you guys are involved with, you also have to, I mean, sometimes when there's a lot of regulations in place, it can be a challenge to really fully adopt an agile approach. And that's where you start looking at, okay, well, there are different hybrid ways that we can be as agile as possible while still making sure that we've follow the regulations and everything that's already in place. And a lot of that requires you to already have a very clear picture of exactly what the outcome is going to be. And that makes it difficult to be agile, because the whole point is you're going to roll something out of value, but if the feedback you get from that early on informs you that the direction you had envisioned going isn't quite the right direction, you need to be able to make adjustments. And that's really the power of an agile approach. You don't go too far in the wrong direction. You can kind of cut off those potential paths that you might have taken had you not had that feedback. So here's the principles. It's more a flexible, adaptive process. An iterative approach with sprint cycles, as we'll talk more about that in a minute. Loosely defined requirements. It's more goals and results based over tasks and procedures based. I would say that's a big differentiator. And as humans, it feels good for us to check things off a task list. And I've caught myself in the past writing down things I've already done just so I can check them off. And many of you have as well. But we have to realize that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. And we can fill our entire days with tasks, our entire team's days with tasks, without really moving one step closer to that end goal. And so we have to be careful of that we're not just being busy for the sake of being busy. And many of us, do that to some degree. And it's because most of the things that we think are goal-based activities are not. They're task-based activities. You really have to take that step back and say, what are we really trying to accomplish here in the end? And in doing so, you can often eliminate some of those things that you've just done habitually, because that's how it's always been done, or at least streamline them to make sure that all your energy and effort is moving you towards what you're trying to accomplish in the end. So, and I'll share a mountaineering example of many of these in a little bit, but change and uncertainty is embraced in an agile environment. And we have more of a dedicated, self-organized team. Not all the time versus a really structured team. But I already talked a little bit about the kind of roles and responsibilities and how you kind of have to have that, the boundaries are a little bit more blurred. You have to have a working knowledge of what others are doing as well, so you can step in. I mean, the whole idea is to everyone trying to reach that same goal collectively. So when it came to our expedition, I would say, we didn't so much subscribe to either approach. We subscribed to what you could call a hybrid approach, in that during the 2 years of planning, we very much had a waterfall mentality. We're not going to leave this up to risk realization. We'll figure it out when we get there. When you're there, you're functioning on a third mental capacity. That's not when you want to be making these critical decisions. And so you want to try to foresee and think about and problem solve all the potential challenges you might have during the 2 years of planning. And so we had rigid requirements, a well-defined schedule, everything you would typically have in a waterfall environment. But where it becomes 100% agile is once the actual execution begins, the climbing. If we're too rigid in our mindset, we're not able to adapt to what such a volatile environment throws at us. And a lot of the teams that were unsuccessful in the end, that they just weren't able to adapt. It would seem like, well, no one could work through what the challenges we were being thrown at, that are being thrown at us. There's always a way if you're open-minded enough to find the way, search, be solutions focused. So here's what the Hybrid Manifesto might look like. Empowered individuals collectively developing and utilizing the right processes and tools. The solutions and results focus drives the tasking and documentation, not the other way around. Transparency, collaboration, building professional relationships was paramount. Building flexibility or balancing flexibility and change with an established strategic plan. Here are the principles. Building flexibility into the linear processes. If you think back at our expedition from this morning, I mean, this is exactly what we had. Incorporating these iterative cycles into a larger sequential approach. High-level requirements that allow for the adaptation, reframing the tasks as I just talked about, balancing the need for rapid responses to change with maintaining some degree of control. We don't want chaos. And empowered team members with an aligned vision and individual roles working together to achieve a common goal. And so kind of at the heart of this, I touched a little bit on in the presentation this morning, is adopting this iterative approach. And for us, it's usually a 1 to 2 week push into the altitude, trigger the production of red blood cells, but then we come back down. And that's where we really start incorporating the lessons learned from that particular iteration. And we would normally spend about 4 to 5 days at base camp afterwards, and part of that is allowing our bodies to build red blood cells. We've stressed our bodies to trigger the red blood cells, and so they continue to produce them, allow us to recover, and allow us to make those adjustments needed. And through the 2 months, we were constantly doing that. At times we would be thrown off our schedule, let's say by storms and sicknesses, and up to a week at a time. And we'd have to figure out, how do we get back on schedule so we don't miss our 2-week weather window at the end of May. And we summited within 2 days of our original schedule. So we did a pretty good job of doing that. And whenever you're doing that, we call that fast tracking. You can't do it without risk. And so without assuming some sort of extra risk, because you would rather do things sequentially. But if the schedule demands, you may have to compress. And so you do 2 activities at the same time that you would rather do sequentially. And so we would look at where can we do it and assume the least amount of risk. And that's what we would come up with, and that's what we would do. So and we can quantify it to some degree nowadays with these finger medical devices, the pulse oximeters, that allow us to take more of an objective approach to the climatization process. Can anyone think of any other advantages of adopting this type of iterative approach? Or have you tried it in any of the endeavors you've been involved with yourself? Anyone think anything? So I touched on a few of them. There's kind of, well, maybe I'll see if anyone have any thoughts on this first. Yeah.
We had a project, an IT project, where initially the project was done in the Waterfall Approach.
Okay.
And after 2 years, we got the final product from the company, and everybody was there to learn how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody universally agreed, we're not using this.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for us. And so from that time forward, we went to sprint.
Yep.
Agile style, Scrum, whatever that process is. And we were able to complete the project.
Yep.
And I came onto the project in October of 16. My first week we had 2 meetings, and they were talking scope and wanted to go live in December. So even Agile doesn't help everything. that gets you to the goal.
Yeah, and there's probably were a lot of wasted resources in developing things that you didn't use in the end when you tried to take the waterfall approach, and that's can be the benefit. I mean, you're obviously good. You're trying things, so there might be things that what do you say the word? Yeah, I guess you are trying, but you want to. The whole idea is to roll something out. Because it's the feedback piece. A lot of times we think, okay, well, it's not just a matter of breaking it down into small little steps. Without the feedback piece, there's no way you can make the adjustment. And so it's really, you want to get the feedback. So whether that's get it in front of a test group, get it in front of the end users ideally, but it depends. I don't know the nature of the software you're talking about. But anyone else have thoughts on this? There's kind of, I would say there's also a psychological advantage in that if you take a traditional, drawn out sequential approach, two things happen. Your team members, either the deadline is so far, or when you're going to roll it out is so far ahead that no one actually takes it seriously until it's almost too late. That's very common. What was the other thing I was going to say? I mean, with a traditional approach, there are a few challenges. That's one of them. Or they kind of, that's where they kind of leave it too late. There's one other, I kind of lost my mind there, but the other problem with a traditional one. But what I would say from the psychological advantage is when you take an iterative approach, there's kind of that more excitement because you're actually rolling out something of value. And then there's this positive energy from actually doing that. And you can kind of bring that into the next iteration. And so that's where really the psychological advantage comes into adopting more of an iterative approach. The other problem I was going to say is people kind of lose interest if it's a really long drawn out process and you're not really rolling anything out for a long time. So those are the two challenges that you often face. Gaining alignment. We did have some challenges with alignment on our expedition. Now I would say we had, a different team dynamic, obviously being a family, and the key is to get your stakeholders involved as early as possible. None of us as humans like to have things dictated to us. We like to feel like our thoughts and ideas are valuable and are part of the process. The challenges we had with our doctors on the mountain were really around it was a conflict of interest in many ways. There were two doctors that were tasked to look after anyone who used that outfitter, the outfitters we did, but they were climbers themselves. And so their number one priority was really to reach the summit themselves. And I think what happened is they got a discount on their expedition if they agreed to be the team doctors. And so you can see the conflict of interest right away. And at times they would be trying to diagnose some really serious situations, and they'd be up at Camp 2 trying to do so over these radios, crackly radios, and it really was quite a disaster. And probably would have cost us the success of our expedition had we not been able to gain alignment with another doctor at base camp. His name was Dr. Burful, and he was from India. He was there supporting an Indian climbing expedition. Really had nothing to do with our expedition at all, other than he was a good-natured fellow that would help anyone in need and had brought a lot of additional medication from India to do just that. And we had tried everything that our doctors had said. And when we first went to see him, I could hardly breathe, let alone swallow. My throat was so inflamed. My sister had these boils on her body from the sun. My father had dislocated one of his ribs from coughing so violently. We were in bad shape. And he agreed to take us on and disagreed with most everything our doctors had said and a lot of what he gave us is actually, not all of it, but some of it was like herbal medications from India. They're used to dealing with these superbugs that are resistant or immune to Western medications. And so we really were able to gain that alignment. And I would say in many ways, he became our dedicated doctor. I wanted to share a technical example, though, because you might be able to, although this is from the mining and metals industry, but you can probably relate to a similar situation you've encountered. So I worked for a couple of years, 1 year really restarting a nuclear plant, but then my wife and I, right after our honeymoon, we moved to Santiago, Chile, and I was involved with developing burners and concentrate burners. But I won us this project in Arizona, and this took us to Arizona for a couple of years. This is actually just outside of, you probably recognize Chase Field. The company I work for, also design that movable roof, so I got to do some work on it. What happened is when President Obama came into power, he put a lot of tight emissions regulations in place. And so the smelters in the US had to comply or be shut down. And so these are hot, dusty, dirty environments. This is just the prototype testing at the fabrication shop. So we haven't put this into operation yet. But when it's in operation, it's a very complex environment. And what you're seeing is the portion of the shell of a huge copper converter. It's a big cylindrical vessel. You charge it with molten material, and then we bubble oxygen-rich air through the bath, and it burns off sulfur dioxide and all kinds of things. It's part of the production of copper. But there's explosions going on in there, and so it's just belching sulfur dioxide and all kinds of horrible gases. And so they had to figure out how to clean this up. And so they tried a bunch of things, weren't able to do it, so they came to me and my team, and so then we designed something from the ground up. And so it was a fun project because we could only be 3 feet off the shell because the entire thing is on trunnions and rotates 360 degrees. But we also couldn't have any electrics on board. So both the lifting and pivoting of this 10-ton lid is done by a single pneumatic motor. So anyway, I won't get too much into the details because really what I want to talk about is very late in the project, I found myself having to go up and meet with the end users. There were about 30 operators that were going to be the end users of this device or machine. And I had my slide deck, and I was in their conference room, and there was about 30 of them in a U shape. And I start going through and explaining, this is what we're going to be showing them the models, this is what we're going to be putting on all the converters. And I look out there, and they've all got their arms crossed like this. And I can see from their body language, they're thinking, if this young punk thinks he's going to put that on my converter, I'll just wipe it right off. Which they could easily do because they're charging these converters with 60-ton ladles, and so one little error and would wipe out 2 years of engineering. And so I could see we have an alignment problem. And now how you end up with alignment problem like that is by leaving key stakeholders out until too late into the process. None of us like to have things dictated to us. And I could see, this project's just going to be a disaster. But the only thing worse than not doing something about this a year or two ago would be to not try to do something about it now. And so what I started doing was having these weekly meetings with the operators, the end users. And what I was doing more than anything was trying to get their feedback on how I could make it more user-friendly, for example. So I'd ask them, well, how, there are ways I could improve the control system. And some of them would share. And whenever possible, I would take that back to the design office and implement those changes. And I kept doing that week after week. And it was quite interesting to kind of see how that mentality shifted. They started to see that their thoughts and ideas were being implemented into this machine. And by the time we put that into operation, they'd taken it on as their baby. Their thoughts and ideas were in this. They wanted it to work. If you can get to that point where the stakeholders and team members actually want whatever you're working towards to succeed in the end, the chances of success are just so much higher. And when we did put this into operation, not everything worked. They would go a week and then it would be shut down. It's a very complex environment. But instead of them saying rip it off and throwing the contract at me and saying this is a piece of junk, they wanted it to work. So a few of the operators, they'd get together with me and they'd say, look, this is what happened. It's shut down. What if we just weld a piece on here? What if we make this little modification? And then we'd just go ahead and do it without even really touching the contract, get it back up and running. And almost everyone in terms of the stakeholders, let's say the broader stakeholders, ever saw was just a huge success first time out of the chute with this project. But I think without that alignment piece, we would have never had such success. Anyone have your own example where you've kind of experienced something like that? And what are some effective methods you've used or seen used to encourage this alignment of goals and objectives? When you kind of, because everyone has different ways they want to go at first, and it's sometimes a challenge. But understanding your stakeholders and when they need to be involved and having the dialogue is certainly the key to gaining that alignment. You have an example? You want to share? A failure story? Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's worth, we're early on thinking, well, who's going to be involved here? What are the different community members or partners or whatever? When do they need to be involved in the process? Because you'll just, it comes back to that none of us like to have things dictated to us, and they'll like fervently kind of resist, right? People don't like change per se unless they've been part of it. So, yeah.
And courts are a little bit different because we're in this adversarial society in which, you have the defense and then you have the prosecution, but getting them on board as well as our sheriff's departments, our probation departments, our pretrial departments, our alternate defense. We've had one big meeting every week for probably about a year and a half, and then we finally got it to 2 weeks. But any major thing coming up, whether it be trying to get jury trials started again, or trying, something new, or if there was some change in the health department guidelines, they all felt heard, I think is one of the biggest things
Yep.
too, for them to just feel like they had peace in it.
Yeah, and that's how you're able to. I mean, it's not like it's going to be a seamless process anyway, but it's certainly a lot better when you're engaging in that way.
It also builds the relationships to be able to discuss things that you do disagree about.
Exactly. Yeah. Any last comments on this one from anyone? All right, I mentioned I was going to kind of share a practical example of this reframing activities. We really had our task list. We'd studied what other expeditions had done, successful expeditions, non-successful expeditions, and really our task when we arrived at base camp was to go up to Camp 1, 19,000 vertical feet, trigger the production of red blood cells, and then come back down through the Khumbu Icefall. But we took that step back and we said, what really is the end goal here? We don't particularly want to expose ourselves to the additional risk of going through the Khumbu Icefall yet one additional time. We just want to trigger the production of red blood cells. Is there a better way? Is there a more innovative or creative way of getting there? And that's really what you want to, that's why you take the step back. You want to say, is there a better way? Maybe what we've always been doing is the best way, but unless you take the step back, you're never going to be able to evaluate it and see if there are better ways. And so what we decided on is we said, well, what if we climb one of these other mountains around here that doesn't have any snow or ice on it, doesn't have any risk associated with it per se, or at least a lot less risk. We'll get up to 19,000 feet, achieve that same end goal without exposing ourselves at all to the risk of the Khumbu Icefall that first time we were scheduled to go through. And that's exactly what we did. We've climbed up to what's known as Advanced Base Camp on Mount Pomori. No snow or ice. We're looking down at the tents of Everest Base Camp here in the distance. And so that's kind of a practical example of how to apply that, taking the step back and saying, well, is there a better way of achieving that end goal? Now, this isn't that easy to actually answer, because without doing a fair bit of thinking about it, many of the things that we think are goal-based activities aren't. They're task-based activities. But can anyone think of anything that comes to mind? An example of a typical task-based activity, and how could it be reframed to focus more on goals and results? Anyone have anything? Sometimes, certain types of meetings that we just always done it this way, or if you need to get information out to community members or something like that, and you think, well, we've always done it this way, but if you take a step back, maybe there's a better way. Like sometimes, like even in engineering, we would have these long drawn out reports, and no one would read them, and so sometimes it's better to just have a one-page, very concise, that has the information you want people to be. If the end goal is to have more engaged stakeholders, what's the best way of getting there? Do you have something? Yep. Jury selection. Okay, jury selection. So, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Yeah, and so exactly. And so that would be about, now some of that's probably like regulatory driven, and maybe there's not a huge amount of flexibility, or maybe there is. But you say, okay, what's the end goal? Is probably something around like a qualified jury, right? And so, is there a better way of getting there? And so, and as I say, sometimes you figure out, well, this is the best way. We just have to keep doing this. But I think you've already kind of identified a possible better way, doing it over Zoom or something like that, so people don't have to take the time away. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And so you guys have already done this, and it sounds like you're having good success. So it's about thinking, well, are there other areas where we can be a lot more effective in getting at the end goals? So, anyone else? Any comments on this one? Okay, I think I already touched on roles and responsibilities and how that really applies to an agile environment, which is what I would say we were in the expedition. I think there was a little thing I wanted to do here on multitasking. Since we're talking about roles and responsibilities, how effective are you at multitasking? Maybe we'll do a little poll here. So you can hold up the number of fingers that corresponds with your vote. Are you number 5, I'm a multitasking rock star; number 4, very effective; 3, somewhat effective; 2, not very effective; 1, very ineffective; or 0, I'm a flustered mess? What's everyone think? So we got some 2s and 3s and 4s and 3s, and any multitasking rock stars? So kind of all over the place. This is what's interesting. There have been a lot of studies done on multitasking. They have actually found that there are about 2.5% of the population that is estimated to be proficient at multitasking. They call them supertaskers. But ironically, if we think we're in that 2.5%, we probably aren't, because those that are in the 2.5% are actually the least likely to actually multitask, because they've determined just how much more effective it is to time block, to carve out specific periods of time in your schedule and block out the distractions. It's more difficult nowadays than ever, because most of the technology that we embrace is designed to capture our attention. And so when an email comes in, it pops up in the corner of the screen. When something happens on social media, or there's audible alerts and visual alerts, and we're continuously jumping back and forth between these tasks. Now, we obviously have very busy lives and busy careers, and so it's not feasible, let's say, to carve out long periods of time because we're interrupted. But there is an aspect of this which is an illusion of our minds, in that we feel as though we're being more productive and effective the more tasks that we're juggling at the same time. And there's this tendency to try to move, let's say you have 5 different things you're working on. I'll move this one forward 1%, and then I'll move this one 1%, and this one, and at least everything's moving forward at the same time. And I've fallen victim to that mentality as well. But it's just killing productivity. Up to 40% of productivity time is lost by this frequent task switching. You feel busy, so you think that you're really moving, being productive. But you have to objectively look at the studies. It's an illusion of our minds, and as much as possible, block out the time, eliminate the distractions, and that's how you're able to really get through things. So this is a tool. We kind of use an informal version of this. It's called a Racy Chart. If you find yourself, you have a lot of meetings, and then it's not clear who's actually accountable for the different activities that are agreed upon. And we would often have this actually in the engineering office. So there'd be some challenge. We'd get together in a meeting room. We'd brainstorm solutions. We'd say, that's the one, let's do it, rah. And then we'd disband. And if no one's actually accountable for it, the next week we'd get together and we'd have the same meeting with the same great ideas and the same rah, let's do it. And that's exactly what can happen week after week. I'm a member of a Rotary, and especially because we're all volunteers, it's like the same, every month we have almost the exact same meeting, and it's like hard to get anything done. And I think we should be adopting something like this. The whole idea with the Racy Chart is you can only have one person who's accountable for that activity. Because if you have more than one, you can see what the letters stand for: responsible, accountable, consultant, informed. If you have more than one A, you just get finger pointing. Because you say, well, I thought you were accountable. I thought you were accountable. You have as many R's as needed in terms of the people doing the actual work. We call those the responsible individuals. And then you also control the flow of information to some degree, and who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed about this. So something like equipment procurement. Now, we lived in different cities, and we worked full-time jobs when we were planning this. So when we got together, it had to be productive. And so we kind of had an informal version of this. And you look at equipment procurement, my father's accountable. My brother and I are responsible in terms of actually doing the work of purchasing this equipment from all over the world. Some of it's only designed to be used in the above 8,000 meters, which you'd only need in the Himalayan mountain range. We had to fly down to little specialized shops and try on our high-altitude mountaineering boots, for example. And then my sister be consulted, our outfitter, and our Sherpas are informed. But something like medication, my sister's accountable. My brother and I'd be consulted. My father's doing the purchasing. So anyway, I won't go through them all, but I like the Racy Chart. And this is I don't know if I'd use the word rudimentary version, but there are more advanced versions where you include the scheduling and things like that as well. But it's kind of it's all in one place. It gets back to what I was talking about. You can use minutes a meeting and have these long drawn out things, but if no one ever really reads them, it's kind of a waste of time. Other than you maybe for legal purposes, you need to keep that. And maybe you still do, but at least this is in one spot. It's very clear, who's accountable, who do we need to inform. And then when you get together, you make adjustments as needed. You look at the accountable person. Is it completed? Yes or no? Why or why not? Do we need to have more responsible individuals moving this forward? So. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my brother and I are kind of pretty technical. Like, he's an engineer, I'm an engineer, and so we like to. Well, I would say, ours was a little bit different, because normally mountaineers would use a guide, a guided expedition, and really all you're doing is transferring risk. The guide is expected to do the risk management and the planning and make sure you don't miss anything, right? In our case, we had to make sure, because if we miss it and we put all this time and money and everything in, and then we're up at Camp 2 and we find out, I thought you were the one that was going to make sure we had an oxygen mask. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
The only thing I have remotely to compare to your experience is long haul sailing.
Okay.
And I know an idiosyncrasy that was utterly insignificant.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of that 3 weeks in a sailboat,
Yeah.
you're ready to shove them all over.
Yeah.
You just can't take it.
Yeah.
And so we talk about process, and this, I think, is a perfect example. We talk about process and rationality
Yeah.
and rational approaches. But you must have run into that where you drive each other insane.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, this is all fantastic. But in my world, it's not that correct. Unfortunately, I don't want to say humans get in the way.
Yeah.
Everybody has their stuff.
Well,
Everybody has different capabilities.
Yeah.
Everybody has different resiliency levels.
But that's why you do something like this, because you're kind of, in a way, you're identifying, well, who has the strengths to deal with that activity, so they should be the one accountable for making sure it gets completed.
Did
Yeah.
you ever get to the point where you want to strangle each
Well, yeah, I would say we had some arguments and some, in general, like we don't get emotionally drawn into, and we would avoid that type of thing even within the mess tent. Like there'd be times where when people are bored and they're sick, like they just strike up an argument to pass the time. And so these arguments, before you know it, they would be at each other's necks. I can remember a few times where, we were, again, you feel horrible, so you're what do you say, easy to anger. And so we would get into these spats, but we wouldn't, we just didn't go too far down, didn't let ourselves be emotionally drawn in so far that we're going to do things or say things that are going to just, ruin our chances of any of us making it to the summit. So then there were probably advantages that we'd done other expeditions. I would say there's probably personality advantages that we get along pretty well anyway. So, because I have had people after some of my talks that come up and said, if that was my brother or sister, that first crevasse, they'd be gone. And so there was that aspect of it. So, yeah. No, true. But that's why you have the meetings. You bring this out and you say, look, this is what we decided last time. Like there's always going to be new people, have new ideas, and they say, well, I thought, and that's why you got to be careful with the accountable, because then you don't want to have the finger pointing. And it's ideal in a team environment if the accountable individual hasn't been just told, you're going to be accountable. If they actually take it on and say, no, like I'm good at that. I'm accountable for that. You're going to get a lot better results versus if you just kind of say, okay, you're accountable for this, you're accountable for this, you're accountable for this. But even that works pretty well because, it's just, they think, okay, well, the meeting's on Wednesday. Have I made sure it's moved forward at all? Like it's almost, it kind of comes back to positive and negative motivation. There's almost like the peer, what they call ridicule, or like if you haven't done anything and like you're going to be in the meeting and you're going to say, look, you said you were accountable. What, has it moved forward? So, so any other comments on this? Well, in general, like you can have an A/R, but in general, the accountable person shouldn't be the person doing the actual work. They should be kind of managing it to make sure it's getting done. And so that's the difference. And we have a small team here. You could have 50 people. And so you might have a lot of people working on that activity. One person making sure it's moving forward. So that's the difference. You have one A, you have as many R's as needed. So, yeah. Okay, so lessons learned in root cause analysis. Am I going too fast? Is any questions on that? So, this is something that is often glazed over, I would say, or passed over, because what ends up happening is by the time you actually like roll something out and it's done, like there's no money left to do lessons learned and spend more time documenting. And there's something else that's a very high priority. And so you just jump onto the next thing. And that would often happen in engineering work. And but then we'd have what we'd call copy jobs, which are very similar to the project we just delivered. Not quite the same, but similar enough that we'd call it a copy job. And we'd end up having the same negative effects. And everyone would throw their arms in the air and say, why didn't we learn for the last time around? And it's because you don't take the time to really document what went well, what didn't, what can we bring forward into the next endeavor we're involved with. And that's where this is important. So when it comes to root cause analysis, we didn't actually use this on the expedition. I wanted to just kind of include it because this is called a fish diagram. And it's if you really want to try to boil it down to the root cause of a particular negative effect, this is why you do it. It might be reduced cognitive function. You start identifying the positive causes. I'll show you what we did in a minute here, but this is called the fish diagram. Oxygen deprivation, physical fatigue, sleep deprivation, mental fatigue, low pressure environment, sickness. Then underneath each of these is another potential root cause. It might be regulator malfunction, low pressure system, pulmonary edema, collapsed lung. I won't go through them all, but you can see the many different things that could lead to the reduced cognitive function. Then you go through and you start just eliminating the ones that aren't the root cause until you've boiled it down to the root cause. What we had done on other expeditions is what you call the 5 whys. And the key is to ask why at least 5 times, because otherwise you end up identifying something that you just think is the root cause, but it isn't. You haven't dug deep enough. And so you might, identify a particular team member or something like that. But if you keep asking why, you find out it's maybe some deep-seated animosity from 2 team members that used to work together, or something someone's bringing in from their family life into the work environment, or something like that. That's deeper. And you don't get there without making sure you ask why enough times. If I was ever going to attempt Everest again, which I'm not planning on it, but I would do root cause analysis on what almost cost my father and I our lives. And we'd actually done this on other expeditions. I'd gotten snow blindness on Denali, for example, in 2004. And very scary, painful situation. We were up at 14,000 feet. And so we identified the root cause, which ended up, I'd taken my glacier glasses off because it was kind of overcast and we were making dinner outside, but the UV is still very, very high. And so that's kind of the root cause. Always wear your glacier glasses. And it was challenging in Alaska. Denali's in Alaska, and so it's 24 hours of daylight as well, which kind of exacerbated the challenges. So if it's ever going to do Everest again, this almost cost my father and I our lives. So we'd say that here's the problem. Why? Our oxygen mask leaked. Why? The seal wasn't good. The mask wasn't designed to work with our goggles. Why? The masks we're using were a very economical version. Why? We didn't put in the required resources and time to get the right masks. Why? We left it to the last minute and were rushed in our decision-making process. And this is really exactly what happened. We'd never used oxygen before. We were running out of time, and so we decided to just transfer the risk. We called up our outfitter and said, look, can you provide us a mask, and what would the cost be? And they said, sure, here it is, and here's the cost, and we just checked it off the list. They did provide a mask. It was a super economical continuous leak system rather than an on-demand system. We're testing it for the first time up at Camp 2. It didn't fit with our goggles. Our saliva froze up and jammed the whole thing. It was just a disaster all around. And something like that is so critical to your safety and success, you don't transfer. You put in the required time and energy and effort and everything to get the right mask. And so that's just a little bit on the root cause analysis. Simplicity is kind of getting onto what I touched on earlier in the presentation in terms of maximizing the amount of work not done. You got to be careful about kind of expending energy that's not helping move you towards what you're trying to accomplish in the end. And we made some mistakes in this area, I would say. The first time we planned on going through the Khumbu Icefall, we thought, well, when we get up to Camp 1, it would be nice to have an extra pair of socks, maybe an extra pair of long johns, and we had a lot of these nice-to-haves. It almost killed us. We were 13 hours getting through the Khumbu Icefall the first time. We barely crawled into Camp 1, and we were reminded at that point, if it's not critical to your safety or success, eliminate it. And we really did take that simplistic approach. Especially when we climbed to Camp 4, my father and sister teamed up, my brother and I teamed up. Between the two of us, one of us would carry 1 sleeping bag and the other would carry 2 sleeping mats. We'd sleep fully clothed in our expedition wear and just drape that 1 sleeping bag over the 2 of us. And in doing so, we were able to reduce our sleeping weight by 50%, by half. Yeah? Yep. The section just above base camp, the Khumbu Icefall, it used to be that every team, we'd set our own route through the icefall, but it's a very volatile, dangerous section. And so they tried to make it a little safer in that part of the fee you pay to the Nepalese government, which is about $11,000 US, at least when we were climbing, part of that goes to a group of Sherpas known as the Khumbu Ice Doctors. They study the icefall every year and every day because during the night, crevasses open and close, rip out ropes, crush ladders, and they have to reestablish the route every morning for that 2-month climbing period. And so they have quite a dangerous job. And many of the deaths do end up being Sherpas from that group, because I wouldn't say the human error deaths, but the kind of natural disaster deaths, because they just have that much more exposure to the Khumbu icefall. But because they're always kind of working with it, they have a pretty good, I guess it's a pretty good guess, I guess you could say, at what angle are these likely to collapse and where we're going to have issues. Now, it was obviously dangerous where we went through, but there was a lot of other areas that were much, much worse. And so their expertise in studying the icefall every year certainly helps make it safer. And so that's kind of that's a pooled resource, you could say. So that's the simplistic approach. Adapting to change. This was pretty important. Not being too rigid in our mindset. Many things change, and how can we kind of go with the go with the flow, I guess, and not be so caught off guard with the fact that our external environment is so volatile that we just can't navigate it anymore. When we're dealing with change, I found it. In my own life, pretty beneficial to kind of think about things through this litmus test. And if you go to any coffee shop in the nation, you'll hear all kinds of people whining about and complaining about and harping about things that don't satisfy this litmus test. And I would say most of the things that people complain about that they want to see changed, they don't satisfy this. And if it doesn't satisfy this test, you're wasting energy. You ask, does it actually matter? A lot of what we gripe about in the mental movies we play through our minds, and if I see this person again, I'll say this and that. Does it really matter? And then you say, is this something I can influence? Or is it kind of beyond my sphere of influence? And then, is it something that I'm actually willing to influence? And if the answer is not yes to all three, it really is wasted energy. We should be, focusing our energy on things that actually matter, things that we can influence, and things that we're willing to influence. And that's how we're able to really bring about change. And not many people do that. It's just so common to focus on things that just way outside of this small little green area that we're actually able to bring about positive change. Here's the types of things that would change on the expedition. Weather conditions, certainly on an hourly basis, sometimes on a minute-to-minute basis. Movement of ice. As the mountain warmed up, we got more and more movement of ice. These rivers started presenting themselves in the upper sections of the Khumbu icefall, for example. The condition of ice. This was actually at base camp, and at first we thought, well, these are really beautiful, and they kind of are, but the sun heats up all the small rocks and melts the ice, except under these huge boulders where you get these pillars of ice. What ended up happening, though, is one of these, eventually they fall off, and one of these boulders came off and crushed one half of the tent of one of the tents that the team doctors were in. He was reading in his tent. Had he been lying down, he would have lost his life because it crushed where his pillow was. And so even at base camp, there are risks that we have to adapt to. And what we did is we redesigned base camp after that and made sure that no one was anywhere near these boulders that could be fatal, even in the safe haven, which we do at base camp. Avalanche frequency. More and more avalanches as the mountain warms up. Our biological and physical state, the nourishment, I don't know if it got worse or just seemed like it got worse because of that phenomenon about losing your appetite. Sicknesses. This is one thing I would say that wasn't orchestrated very well by the outfitter. This is the mess tent. And it's kind of, there's this natural divide. And so we're taking the picture from the open side. If you were sick, you had to go into quarantine. What ended up happening is the leader of the outfitting expedition, he got sick himself, and he said, I never get sick. We need to put some rules in place. And so you had to sit in quarantine. And so I'm sick. I'm in quarantine, which had some practical advantages because you were kind of running out of the tent every 10 minutes anyway. But if you were healthy, you got to go down to the healthy end. There are two problems with this, the way they implemented this, though. The first was most of the sick climbers, they didn't want to get additional sicknesses from other sick climbers. And so they just pretend they were healthy, go down and infect the whole bunch. But the bigger problem was if you are at the healthy end, the cook would come in with whatever slop they'd put together. You pass your bowl and plate down. It gets hacked on and sneezed on and touched by all these sick climbers. Then they put the food in. Then it gets yet another round of hacking and sneezing and touching. And then you eat your meal. And I didn't even, after seeing this a few times, I didn't even go into the mess tent in the final weeks. I just couldn't, I'd make myself like a freeze-dried meal with boiling water because I couldn't afford to be yet another week or so with the other sicknesses. Here's the biggest change we made, though, to our original plan. We'd never really planned on separating our team. And we have strengths and weaknesses, roles and responsibilities. We kind of, work well together and pick up the slack in areas where each of us are weak. But we soon found out that if, for the entire expedition, one or more of us was so sick we couldn't even function. If all of us waited at base camp for that one sick climber to have recovered, we would have never, by that time the next person was sick. We would have never gotten one step past base camp. And so we got together and said, well, none of us like this situation, but this is our current reality. Is there a way we can work with it and continue forward? And what we came up with was those that are healthy have to be acclimatizing. Those that are sick have to be recovering at base camp. And I would say that was probably the biggest change that we had to make versus how we'd originally planned. And again, it's kind of having that not too rigid a mentality, so you're able to do that. In what ways is court management changing nowadays, and how can we best prepare for and manage these changes? It's probably been the last couple of years of certainly been one change after another, but anyone have any thoughts? I mean, it's often, we've already talked about kind of going to more virtual appearances and things. Anything else though? Yep. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So that's maybe one of the bigger changes that's kind of been thrown out all of you. So anyone else? Anyone who's been kind of in the industry for a long time? Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's some it's always, yeah, it's been probably uncomfortable, but there will be some positive things that come out of that. Kind of comes back to that parabolic relationship I was sharing earlier. You get too far on the right, and it's hard. It's a big ship. It's hard to steer it, move it into different directions. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have to make a lot of changes without feedback. And we try to get stakeholders involved,
Mm-hmm.
but things have to happen very quickly. And so now we have a chance, hopefully, to get that feedback so that we can improve on the changes. I really appreciate it. I am from Washington, and I was pleasantly surprised at the Chief Justice's comments this morning. They were excellent. But I mean, he really has a vision. He is exactly the way you see him. That's how he operates. He wants to see how we can do better.
Yeah.
And the only way we can do better is involve stakeholders. But at least in the first year of COVID, stakeholders were not as involved as they should have been.
No. Yeah. Yeah. And I was thinking the same thing. I mean, he's starting with the end goal rather than getting caught up in the tasks. and trying to find better ways of kind of serving the end user. So, any other comments on this? Mm-hmm.
I hear it both in their remarks, but outside of the pandemic, generally because of all the advancements in technology, I feel like change management.
Mm-hmm.
So managing a fairly slow-moving and archaic system through faster changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anyone else? Okay, so I want to touch a little bit more on resolving conflict. So again, I kind of shared that graph, but here's some of the ways that we resolve conflict. And there's really 5 of them. And it's about, knowing which one to use based on the situation. And they all have advantages and disadvantages. And I'll share a quick mountaineering example of each. But the first is withdraw or avoid. Near the end of the climb, a conflict arose with another climber who was trying to claim one of our partially filled oxygen cylinders. And this isn't uncommon in mountaineering, especially on Everest. But I think even in scuba diving, there's lots of stories where when people are about to lose their lives, kind of that reptilian brain takes over and they do whatever they need to do to survive. And so we'd left one partially filled cylinder up at the balcony, if you remember, above the south face. And we planned on picking it up and using it on the way down. And when we got there was another climber there. He had it in his arms and he said, "No, this is mine and I'm not letting it go." And so a conflict arose. And in that instance, we really didn't have the time or energy to continue that conflict. And so we just withdrew. And it's a win-lose approach. And so it's, it's not often a great approach, but sometimes it is, because you have to realize it's better to just let this go and kind of, let's say, win in the end, if you could think of it's going to be better in the end, than to just dig in your heels and, is this the mountain, what's that saying? Is this the mountain you want to die on? And so you have to, that's what a withdrawal is. Just knowing when it's time to withdraw and just let this go. And so that's what we did in that situation. Another one, smooth or accommodate. After a month of climbing, a conflict arose within our team pertaining to whether we should deviate from our schedule and go down 3,000 feet below base camp. This was around the time when my father had dislocated one of his ribs from coughing so violently, and he thought it had already been weeks of trying to recover, and he thought the only way I'm going to recover is if we go down below base camp, expose our bodies to the additional oxygen, and maybe that'll work. And so we had a conflict because not all of us agreed. I was of the opinion, well, we spent 2 years kind of, planning this out. At the very least, we're taking on a huge amount of additional risk by losing acclimatization. And so we had a couple of us on either side, and in that instance, I decided, okay, I'm just going to kind of concede my position, because I realized, if the team falls apart and when I just kind of dig into my heels and it lasts indefinitely, we're not going to have a chance. And it wasn't always me that made the concession, but at times you just have to concede in order to smooth or accommodate, and that's what we ended up doing. We went 3,000 feet below base camp. Compromise or reconcile. At times there weren't enough tents at higher camps. Many of the climbers, when lots were present. This happened particularly one time when there was some storms higher up, and almost everyone who'd used that outfit, or we did, had moved up to camp 2, and there just weren't enough tents. And generally, you don't want to share a tent with another person. 2's bad, 3's very bad, because you're almost sure to catch whatever sickness they have. And this was almost a bloody conflict. We weren't so much involved. It was mostly between some of the other climbers, and they were throwing each other's stuff around and cussing and swearing. And this is my tent. And really, it was our one of the lead from the outfitting group who had to step in and kind of facilitate this compromise and get everyone to realize. No one likes this situation, but people will die if they're sleeping outside, so we have to make compromises. And so it's a compromise we'd call a partial win, or a partial lose. No one party is completely appeased, but all are partially appeased. Force or direct. Forcing, we seldom resorted to this because it's a win-lose approach again. Here, my example is not even very good. The exception was one of us was too sick, weak, or unwilling to do the task. Then the person actually doing it got to dictate how it was done. And and there weren't, I can think of a few. It's usually my father who was kind of, too weak to do any of it, but kind of dictating how it was done. And we just say, no, I'm doing the work. This is how it's going to be done. So yeah, we did have a few conflicts. Again, this is a win-lose approach. But often you have to resort to this if there's not, usually when there's not enough time to work through the other conflict resolution strategies. But you have to realize that, so if you're doing this all the time, I mean, you'll just have, no one will want to work with you, and you'll have no one who's kind of wants to, let's say, step out for you, because it's going to create animosity. But at times you have to force a direct anyway, realizing it'll create animosity, but we don't have the time to work through other things. We'll patch up the relationships later, and that's where you would resort to a force a direct. Probably the best one is a collaborator problem solve. We had a conflict around the start date of our expedition. My brother and sister were still in university. And so what it dictated was we were going to have to start the expedition 2 weeks later than we should have started if we wanted to be in an optimal position to 2 months later make a push into the altitude. And so we had a conflict. I was of the opinion that if we can't do this optimally with all the time and resources and everything, we shouldn't even do it this year. We should put it to a different year where we can do it optimally. But we had a conflict, and what we got together and we decided to problem solve. And what we came up with was my father, sister, and we flew over earlier before my brother, when he was still writing these exams, and with a power of attorney from him so that we could deal with all the logistics that we had to deal with in Kathmandu. And then when he finished that exam, he was able to fly over. He didn't even have to go into Kathmandu. And we'd already started up the Khumbu Valley. He met us at Namche. And in doing so, we were still a little bit behind schedule, but we were able to save about a week's time in problem solving in that way. So those are kind of the 5 different ways. And it's, as I say, it's about kind of knowing which one to use based on the situation that you're faced with. And I would say we did a pretty good job of determining which one to use and how to move forward. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on, I just want to make sure I have in the last about 10 minutes, is building trust in relationships. And a lot of what we've talked about kind of culminates in this, developing a level of trust. It's difficult to build trust. It's easy to lose trust quickly, and then it's even more difficult to regain trust. But it's an essential foundation for any successful team. Without it, teams fall apart. Through effective team management and healthy dynamics, that's how we develop it. Now, the challenge is in a lot of team environments is developing trust quickly. When we're deciding whether we can trust someone, and most of this happens subconsciously, but we're really thinking back to all the different interactions we've had with that individual, everything we've heard about them. Do we trust the individual that we've heard that from? And that's really what's going into that decision or the gut feeling of whether we can trust the individual with that. Maybe it's, there's different levels. A high level would be with your finances or your kids. Like, it does take time to develop that level of trust. But there are ways that we can speed up that development of trust. And I'll talk about a few of them. Where we did a lot of our team development and trust development, I guess you could say, at least in, as I say, we have a different team dynamic. And so there was already a high level of trust there. But on the mountaineering side, where we did a lot was on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Anyone been to Mount Washington? No? You can actually drive to the summit or take the Cog Railway, but it's not a very high mountain, but it experiences some of the highest winds in the world. And so you can, within a day, you can be in the same conditions that it would normally take you a week to get to on other mountains. And so here's someone who left their vehicle at the summit, for example. We would jump straight up in the air and land about 2 feet to the one side. The wind is just so strong at the summit of Mount Washington. So we were a pretty close-knit team. But here's some of the ways that, or examples of building the trust. I would say we built a really good trust relationship with the outfitter who had provided some of the logistical support. And I think why we developed that so quickly was because of their transparency. There was a lot of different challenges going on. I'll talk more about the political challenges here in a minute, but they were just very transparent with everything. We never felt like they had some sort of hidden agenda. And as humans, we're pretty good at picking up when there's something else going on. You know, we can pick it up in people's body language. And you don't necessarily know what it is, but there's some kind of a hidden agenda there. And so if you want to build trust, it's the transparency. Maintaining integrity. One of the times I was climbing on the first time actually climbing on the Lhotse face, a very sick climber was coming down from above who had the cerebral edema where the fluid had leaked into his brain. And he was with a Sherpa who was trying to get him down as quickly as possible before he lost his life. And this sick climber, he stumbled up to me and he just said, water, need water. And I gave him the last of my water. But in doing so, I'm putting my own life at risk. Without the water, my body doesn't acclimatize to the same degree, and I could easily be in the same condition that he was in. I'd made a similar decision in 2004 on Denali, where there was a very weak climber that wasn't able to go down and pick up their gear cache. And I said, I'll pick up his and mine. And we were hauling sleighs, and there was so much weight on it, it flipped over above a crevasse, and I couldn't go back. So I had to just pull it upside down for a little ways. And I ended up tearing both of my Achilles tendons at the insertion points. And I was 3 years before I was able to run again. And it still gives me some issues to this day. And so it's not without consequences when you make these moral or ethical decisions, and there's often good reasoning on both sides. I would say the media has really cast a negative light on a climber that would pass another climber in need. And first and foremost, we do have this moral obligation to help out another human in need, but the other side of it is there's lots of climbers there that go with the mentality, if I get in trouble, there's other climbers that will help me out. And if you were the type of person that would help anyone in need, you wouldn't even be able to get off the plane. There's climbers in Lukla that should be hospitalized. Arguably, we should all be hospitalized, but so it's kind of maintaining that integrity. In that case, without the water, I didn't know how far I had to go, but it was only about another hour before I was able to chop snow and ice and replenish the water. Here's the political disaster that I was talking about. And I would say this created a lot of distrust with the Chinese government in particular. And this is 2008, the last time they had the Olympics in Beijing, China. And the north side of the mountain used to be the country of Tibet, which is now occupied by China. And so the Tibetan people, they're fighting for their independence. They want to be free from Chinese rule. And so that was all fine. There was a lot of media around it, though, because the Chinese government wanted to bring the Olympic torch to the summit of Mount Everest as part of the publicity around the Olympics. And the Tibetan people saw it as a great opportunity to get worldwide publicity on their cause. And the Chinese government didn't want to have anything to do with that. They didn't want to risk the world rallying behind the freedom of Tibet. And so they shut down the north side of the mountain. They had the military, because Nepal's such a poor country, China has huge influence, and so they had the military posted at base camp and at Camp 2 with rifles, ordered to shoot anyone that passed Camp 2 that could interfere with the torch run, or that could get any kind of free Tibet propaganda into the media. And it's a different world over there. They took it very, very seriously. You weren't allowed any communication device. At one point, we got our satellite phone confiscated. So there was a lot of kind of rumors, and we don't know what was true and what was not true, but around this, there was just very little communication around it all. And so it created a lot of animosity, and luckily they did reach the summit with the torch, and they removed those restrictions. Patience and humility. There was a question after the presentation around this. I would say that's how we built such a great relationship with our Sherpas. Connecting on a personal level. This is why a lot of organizations do things outside of the work environment. You go out for beer or bowling or something. It's been shown if you want to speed up the development of trust, you have to connect on a deeper level. And when you go out for wings or something like that, people open up. You make yourself a little bit vulnerable. You share something about your kids or your dog or something like that. It encourages other people to make themselves vulnerable, and that's how you develop a deeper trust relationship. Dependability. And this, as I say, again, it was one of the differentiators between our team and some of the other ones. Like, the last thing I'd want to do after climbing for 13 hours is chop additional ice for my sister that, say, she shows up a half hour later. But I would kind of just, do it anyway. And next week, the roles would be reversed and she would have to do it anyway. The other teams we would see, they would say, well, I wish I could, like I want to, but I've just been climbing for 13 hours. No one could chop additional ice. I can hardly chop enough ice for myself. And then the next week, the roles are reversed. Well, I wish I could, but no one could. And you can soon see how that team falls apart. Encouraging feedback, requesting and giving feedback. That was just kind of the dialogue between our Sherpas. Show a genuine interest. I think this is how we built such a great relationship with our with Dr. Burfall. Create friendships, follow that kind of golden rule or platinum rule, which is really do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And that's really understanding individual differences. Not everyone wants the same thing that we want. Why was it important in our expedition? It allowed each of us to focus on certain tasks at times and trust others to complete other tasks. Gave us a sense of security that others were looking out for each of us. We had a true interest in each other's success and safety. We didn't feel hesitant or scared about putting our lives in each other's care. We were able to confidently share the difficult decisions and responsibilities. And some of this applies just to mountaineering, but most of it is to any team environment. Our objectives were aligned so that we had this unified goal. And this is maybe the most important. We're able to pool this limited knowledge and limited cognitive capacity that we have at altitude to make relatively good decisions, even in this low oxygen environment. We're aware that we're prone to making errors, so we'd kind of run things by each other a few times. Are we missing anything here? And that's how we were able to do it. Anyone have an example? Just before we conclude, what are some effective strategies you used or seen used to kind of build this trust? I've also often thought of it in this way, and kind of this is almost reverse engineering it. In what ways are others able to gain your trust? And in that way, you can kind of say, well, what do I need to do to gain trust in this situation? And I've often, kind of done that or seen like. I've had, let's say, managers or leaders on the team that kind of, there's a mistake made, and even maybe it's partially my fault or completely my fault, and they kind of take the the accountability for it. That's one way you can really develop trust, rather than just passing the blame every time you can. Not singling someone out. Okay, this has happened. We've got to be. Let's find the solution. We move forward. It's done. So. Anyone have anything you want to share? This last one? Okay, the last thing I was going to talk about, sometimes this is asked at the end of the presentation. Anyone heard of George Mallory? Anyone? If you, yeah, a couple. Yeah, if you've seen the Everest movie or read any mountaineering book, really, they often talk about George Mallory. He was a very famous climber back in the 1920s. And I'm related to George Mallory through family. We of course share the same surname, but his grandfather married one of my ancestors and had to adopt the Mallory name. So that's kind of the family connection. But he was a famous climber back in the 1920s, 30 years before Sir Edmund Hillary climbed. And he was seen right near the summit of Everest on the north side with this high-powered telescope. And then he disappeared and lost his life, him and his climbing partner, Sandy Irving. He didn't become famous until 70 years after his death, when his body was discovered, completely preserved for all those years. And from the additional clues that they found with him, they have this hypothesis that all the clues support that he made it to the summit 30 years before Hillary and was on his way back down. And so there have been teams, and they've actually contacted me about whether I want to be involved on go back to that location and try to find the body of Sandy Irving or their camera, which would be could be the conclusive evidence to rewrite the history of Everest. And so that's kind of why a lot of mountaineering books talk about George Mallory. But I wanted to kind of just end with a quote from him. I'm often asked, as he was, why climb? Why would anyone want to do something like this? And this is his answer. I especially like the last part. This is what he said. If you cannot understand that there's something in man which responds to the challenge of this mountain and goes out to meet it, that the struggle is the struggle of life itself, upward and forever upward, and you won't see why we go. what we get from this adventure is just sheer joy. We do not live to eat and make money. We eat and make money to be able to live. That is what life means and what life is for. Therefore, if you have to ask the question of why climb, you will not understand the answer. So that's George Mallory. Any questions on anything I just talked about, or any questions you didn't have answered from this morning? Hopefully that gives you some different ways of thinking about how you can become more agile in your thinking and when you're executing different endeavors. So, any last questions? Yep. Well, it was quite she was emotionally pretty. All my family members have a section of my first book, and she talks about the emotional side of what she was going through and some of the strategies that she used to kind of get her mind off of ruminating on what could possibly happen, because there are natural disasters that could wipe out a whole team, and that's her entire family, right? So that was pretty tough on her, and not having the communication, and people died while we were there. This would show up in the media. They often don't release the name. We put everyone through quite an emotional roller coaster because of that. So now I don't think she wants to like go back and make another attempt or anything like that. She was never as keen as the rest of us anyway, is what I would say. When we first, not really. Like when we kind of got home, there was we kind of got back into the main swing of things, and that was it. So, I mean, there were a few like get-togethers, and everyone wanted to hear the stories, and so, yeah, proud mom, yeah. But I think she was just glad everyone made it home, and she's not quite as keen on taking those types of risks. So she's probably the only smart one out of the five of us. Any last questions? If anyone didn't get a book and wanted one, there's just three left. And then yours if you still want it. Otherwise, you can scoop it from her. She got the last psychological one. Any last questions, though? Yeah. I can do a Zelle. Do you know a Zelle transfer? It's like a Chase thing. I have a Chase account. I don't know if you can. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Yeah.
All right.